Welcome to Charlie Cinema Club, and today I want to talk about two films again. The two adaptations of the same material, and two very different movies at that. The 1930 and 1922 versions of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. First of all, I haven't read the book, so I can only comment to a limited extent on how faithful the films are to the source material. I know that the 1930s version stayed quite close to the book, merely changing the order of some events, while the 2022 version introduces an additional storyline outside of the battlefield, leaves out several central moments, and significantly rewrites the ending. Yet it's precisely this ending that gives the story its title, and one of the reasons why I like the 2022 film less than the older one. But let's start at the beginning. All Quiet on the Western Front tells the story of young Paul Bäumer, who, fired up by the fiery patriotic speeches of a teacher, volunteers for service in the First World War along with his entire class. In episodic form, the story depicts his experiences, his relationships with other soldiers, especially with the older comrade Kaczynski, called Kat, the loss of his friends, the endurance in the trenches, and the absurdity of war. In the final days of the war, Paul also falls, on a day so quiet that the army report merely states, "All quiet on the Western Front." At least, that's the story told by the book, and if not word for word, then in spirit, by the 1930 film. In the 2022 remake, however, a deranged general calls on Paul's company to snatch a small victory for Germany by capturing one last French stronghold. This insane maneuver is certainly not nothing new, but rather quite the opposite. Another scene that, for me, is among the most striking and harrowing of the story, because it so tangibly portrays the brutalization of young men in war, is barely recognizable in the 2022 version. A comrade of the boys, a school friend who volunteered with them, is shot. His leg is badly injured and must be amputated. Soon it becomes clear that he won't survive the night. While he is still conscious and struggling to come to terms with the loss of his leg, his friends start arguing over who will get his good boots. The new film reduces this to a graphic leg injury, a quick death, and a nameless soldier taking his food ration. Paul's home leave is also entirely missing from the 2022 remake, even though those moments of not fitting into the world outside of the war were formative for that generation's war narratives. So formative, in fact, that they inspired bestsellers like Narnia, where children command armies in a parallel world only to return home and not be taken seriously. That is not the fantasy element of the story, that is biographical. Instead, the 2022 film shows scenes parallel to Paul's story depicting the peace negotiations between Germany and France. And while the indifference of those in power is indeed shocking, the narrative gains little from it. Overall, it feels more like an attempt to add a bit of star power and marketability through Daniel Brühl, something the film didn't really need. Whereas the 1930 film tells more of the group story, even though Paul is unmistakably the main character, the 2022 version relies on intimate close-up portraits of Paul, so focused on him that all the other characters fade into the background and lack depth. And yet it is here where actor Felix Kammerer truly shines. He carries the film with his powerful performance, palpable fear, and a talent for looking convincingly filthy and drenched. A big shout out to makeup and costume design, they did an outstanding job. The 1930s adaptation is an unparalleled feat of production. Decades later, few films can match its sheer scale of extras and equipment. The aerial shots of the battlefield, filled with explosions, debris, and running soldiers, may seem almost commonplace now, but were groundbreaking at the time and still impress today. Nevertheless, the new version also looks fantastic. The color grading is masterful, making close-up shots of the battlefield resemble recolored historical footage. Of course, I must mention the similarity to 1917 here. Both the visual style and scene structure are at times very similar, and while much of that surely stems from historical accuracy, it occasionally feels somewhat derivative. Even so, 2022's All Quiet doesn't reach the cinematic brilliance of 1917's incredible one-shot sequence across the battlefield. And while the 1930s version is one of the most important war films ever made, the new adaptation brings little to nothing new to the table. It's still an enjoyable film, but a far cry from the original's brilliance and a worse adaptation of the book overall. Which one did you prefer? Let me know in the comments. Bye!